thought about what it looks like to stay intentionally small in your life. We're going to dig into that on this episode of the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk. Right now, you're going to meet Luke Kuepfer, campus pastor, speaker, and coach, share about how biblical alignment became so important to him.
I could go on a lot on Jesus and leadership, but it was more about after he left than when he was here, right? A success is all about, do I raise up successors? And Jesus actually told his guys, he said, greater works you're going to do when I go back to the Father. That's phenomenal to me. He set them up for success. It was about a movement.
Here's my conversation with Luke Kuepfer. Today, I have my new friend Luke with me. Luke, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Danielle. Great to be with you today.
So, Luke, we met through mutual friends, Junior Ziegler, and he's just talked so highly about you. You're like one of the most interesting men in the world to him, So I would love for you to kind of just share about who you are, what you do on a day-to-day basis.
And that's, kind of a changing thing for me now that I've been invited to become a campus pastor at the Bridge, which is where I met Junior. And he's actually one of my favorite preachers. I love hearing him preach, and I have the great privilege now of preaching alongside him at the Bridge. Originally, I was born in Canada, Southern Ontario, and married my wife from Indiana, basically 28 years ago. We're going to be celebrating our 28th year in just a few months, and got 3 kids. I live in Chicago area today, and great to be on the show with you.
Oh, thank you. So you grew up Mennonite. I'd love for you to share a little bit about, in case people are unfamiliar with that. And how did Jesus play a role in your life as a young kid?
I'm very, very fortunate to have grown up in a true Christian family. My dad was an alcoholic before he married my mom, and has a radical life transformation story, how he was delivered from drunkenness. And yes, I grew up in an Amish Mennonite home. Amish Mennonites, just another denomination in Christianity, really goes all the way back to the Reformation, where Switzerland, Holland, and that neck of the woods of Europe, this group of people basically said, we want to pull away from, be involved in the state. We believe that Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. And so we really believe in the kingdom of God in very practical ways. And so, probably one of the biggest distinguishing factors between them and the rest of evangelicals, although they are very evangelical, would be the involvement with the state or with, the military. They don't take up their guns and shoot and fight and all that. But really, in many regards, I was very fortunate to have grown up in a very godly home. My parents actually were missionaries from when I was age 4 to age 7. I lived in Central America. My parents adopted 2 children, a total of 5 kids in our family now, and just had a tremendous influence, tremendous impact on my life. More is caught than is taught, they say. And Dad went on to become, a board member on 3 mission boards. One wasn't enough for him. And I think, again, that had tremendous influence in my life growing up. But yeah, very conservative home. We didn't have a television, didn't have a radio. Most of my life, even as a teenager, we did not play any musical instruments. We didn't drive horse and buggies, although the Amish do that. We were a step removed from that. We had cars, we had electricity, which many Amish people would not. But we were one step removed, and I really have no regrets. I'm kind of lost, when people talk about their favorite shows or actors, but there's really not all that bad connected to that.
It's interesting that you said your dad was a missionary, because you'd also said that you and your wife had been missionaries for some time. So was that a passion of yours? Was that something that you felt called to do, or did that just kind of fall into your lap?
Yeah, what a great story. Because at age 19, believe it or not, I became a school teacher. And in the Mennonite world, we have a lot of parochial schools. And there was one about 3,000 miles away from home. I grew up in Southern Ontario, but Alberta, Canada, there was a small Mennonite community that needed a teacher. And for me, it meant moving to the West, being able to ski the Rockies and join a hockey team. I always wanted to join a hockey team. And there was this opportunity in Alberta and teaching school on the side. So I went west to ski the Rockies, play on a hockey team, and teach school on the side. And I ended up teaching school school, loving it. And for 3 years of my life, I learned that I was a communicator, that I love to teach. I love to see the lights come on for people. And sports took a back burner during that time. I fell in love with Jesus. I met a guy by the name of Sam that just really had me fall in love with Jesus and his word. It was one of the greatest times of my life, those 3 years. So it was during that time when I was in the West that I had an opportunity to go to China to smuggle Bibles with a friend of mine. And I went to my school board and said, hey, can I take off in the middle of school term? And they're like, sure, yeah, you get a break, man, which is really cool. So for about 3 weeks, I went to China and actually Hong Kong, and we went into China from Hong Kong. Back then, Hong Kong was still under the British domain. And that was probably the beginning of a journey with this idea that there are people groups out there that have never heard the name of Jesus before. And Danielle, I had never heard of unreached people groups, but I met a person over there that introduced me to this concept. We went up into a part of China where there's this group called the Nashi, and they were matriarchal. The women wore these firmament capes. There was a 17,000-foot mountain in the background that was a goddess mountain, and there was goddess worship and a very unreached people group, not patriarchal, but matriarchal. Ladies had ajus, which were uncles. And you didn't really know, who the dad was of the kid. You knew who the mom of the kid was. It was fascinating. But God began to give me a real burden for unreached peoples. Romans 15 says, Paul's ambition to preach the gospel where it was never preached before. And God began to stir in me a burden. I came back to North America and I invited my friend that I had met in Asia that had introduced me to this concept of unreached people groups, had taken me to the Nashi people. I said, man, you've got to come back and share this vision with our people, because our Amish Mennonite background, they've never heard of unreached people groups. So him and I, we got in my little car, we drove, oh goodness, it was like 30 days. We hit 33 places in Ontario and then like 5 other states. We just went from school to church to youth group, sharing this vision. And then partway through that trip, this one youth group said, yeah, we want to pray for these unreached people, because that's really what my friend was promoting, was prayer for the unreached. But we also want to go. And Paul, my friend that was from Southeast Asia, was based there working among unreached. He looked at me and he said, well, Luke's taking a team next year. I wasn't taking a team, but all at once I was taking a team. And so that's really actually how I met my wife as well. She joined that team. And I said to my friend Paul, I said, I'll get him to Hong Kong, but after that, it's your baby. So that's really how this whole thing began, quite frankly, Danielle. Began with a vision of going up from a short-term mission trip. And then God giving me a real burden for unreached people groups. And the second year, we took teams back. First year, my wife came on that trip. Back then, not even a girlfriend at that point. But the second year, my dad came and another pastor came. And they saw this vision and they said, man, we got to get behind our kids. Because my friend and I were both on this second year team taking Jesus films and Bibles and gospel tracts to the unreached. And out of that was born a organization called Global Tribes Outreach. And then later, I got married. My wife and I moved to Thailand. We lived 10 years, and we directed this new mission organization among the conservative Mennonites that was focused on unreached people groups.
Wow, Luke, that's crazy to think, like, for just a young boy growing up in Canada, not even watching television shows or anything like that, to have that spirit of adventure, to smuggle in Bibles in China, like such a huge transition and like such a leap of faith at the same time. So was that like a scary turn of events for you? Did that seem exciting? Just to smuggle in anything. Like, I'm scared to smuggle in things to the theater sometimes. Here's some extra candy, kids. But like to smuggle in Bibles, to have the threat of like being hurt or put in jail, like that's a lot.
I think God kind of gave me a spirit of adventure as a young person. What's crazy, I haven't even told you the wild part of that first trip to Southeast Asia. I'm talking when we took a team over, and we went up to this one unreached people group way up in the Southwest. And within 15 minutes of passing out literature, the police closed in on us and arrested us. And we were apprehended for like 4 days. We were interrogated. And then we were kicked out of the country. The next year I went back, and we were way up in a Muslim area, going out in the middle of the night, really for 2 reasons. One was so that there wasn't this connection with a white face to giving the word of God, therefore a foreign religion. So we distributed the literature at night, so there was no connection to a white man's religion. But the second reason, of course, was for our own physical safety, because Muslims get very excited very quickly if they perceive something that is a threat to their religion. And that, might be another story for another time, Danielle. But that time we got chased by a guy with a big stick. And also that year, I was arrested again. Being a Canadian and an American passport, whatever, you're protected. You're basically going to get kicked out of the country. They slap you around a little bit, but it's nothing too crazy serious in contrast to our Chinese brothers and sisters who actually live there. So we were very fortunate. But yeah, I think God gives some of us a spirit of adventure. And looking back, I sometimes go, wow, we did some pretty crazy things. But when God is in it, honestly, if God before us, who can be against us? And really, what does the word say? Fear not those who can, take your life, but those who can really, take your soul. We really have nothing to fear with the army of one, God, on our side.
When you were talking about unreached people groups, I just had listened to another podcast from someone else the other day about that same thing of just recognizing, there are people that are unreached within our workplaces, but they have the concept of there are local churches. But when you're talking about a tribe that is out in the middle of nowhere and has never heard the name Jesus before, it's just it's shocking to believe that. What is one way that we as Christians can be more aware of that? And also pray for unreached people groups. Yeah,
my friend Paul is such a hero of mine. And he started an organization called AsiaHarvest.org, AsiaHarvest.org. I actually promote this organization more than my own, because here's a man that was, living on the streets, a guy with an incredible testimony who was radically saved. And within a few months was in Asia. He said, I can be a donkey for Jesus. And then that led to his discovery of unreached people groups. But, he's dedicated his entire life, his website, to really strategically partnering with local missionaries in these areas to share the good news of Jesus with those who have never heard. And I have to give a shout out to Asia Harvest, one of the greatest organizations that I think does the most bang for your buck, in fact, in terms of just reaching the unreached, those who have never heard about Jesus before. But there is a lot of information at that site. He wrote the book, Operation China. I believe he's working on Operation India here soon. And so, that would be probably a good place to start.
Well, Luke, I think stories matter. I mean, just right now, hearing about smuggling Bibles and the Mennonite faith is multiple stories right here. It just helps me better understand people, learn people's stories, have empathy. And so I would love to kind of hear just a little bit more about one of your own personal stories today.
Yeah, I think I said this earlier. My dad, one mission board wasn't enough for him. He had to be on 3. And one of those mission boards was Voice of the Martyrs. Richard Wurmbrand would be a name that a lot of people would recognize. When I was a kid, we had Richard in our home and Sabina. In fact, little humorous side story here. My mom didn't realize they were Jews, and she tried to serve bacon for breakfast the next morning. She said, you should have seen the look on Sabina's face. They were very gracious. And Richard Wurmbrand, started the organization Voice of the Martyrs, and Dad was on the Canadian board up until he passed away. But, because of that, we had all these fascinating people coming through our home. And one of them was this really super tall guy from Germany. And I'm really short. So the tall ones always stand out to me. And this guy, I always love to ask my audiences, does anybody know what his name is? And everyone kind of looks at me kind of weird. I'm like, well, it's Hans from Germany. Come on, This tall guy named Hans from Germany. As we boys were scampering off to bed, he comes over, and we lived in a big old farmhouse. But he looks up the staircase as we were running to our beds. And he said, boys, turn to Psalm 119 and memorize verses 9 and 10 and never forget them. And I always say when a tall man from Germany by the name of Hans says, memorize, you do it. And back then, I learned all the verses in the King James, the King Jimmy version, as I call it. And so I'll have to quote it in that version. But it goes like this. Wherewithal shall the young man cleanse his way? By taking heed thereto according to thy word. With my whole heart have I sought thee. Oh, let me not wander from thy commandments. And little did Hans know the seed that he planted in my heart at that time, how that would reverberate into my future, how even working in the business world today, how working in every capacity and role that I am in, the word of God is really the defining motif of my life. I teach the Bible in business world. I have the privilege of teaching the Bible in church world. It's just in the nonprofit that I lead, training leaders. It is all biblically centered on the model of Jesus. And Hans gave me a gift that day, gave me an alignment with the Word of God, an anchor, a rock. And, it's interesting. Just 2-3 years ago, my wife and I were in Estes Park where we had honeymooned. We were there for our 25th anniversary. And we were up at this one beautiful lake. We were having lunch. And there was a family there with a young son. And we just started to have conversation. There were some Christian folks up from Texas. We were having a great time having lunch together. And near the end, I said, you know what? I'm going to pass on to him what Hans did for me. And so I said, young man, turn to Psalm 119 and memorize 9 and 10 and never forget it. And, a couple months later, I got an email from the dad, and he was just so grateful for pouring into his son. But for me, it was just doing what had been done for me as a kid and the impact, the influence that this man Hans had from Germany. The Word of God is my anchor for everything I do, Danielle. And thank you, Hans. Going all the way back to when I was just a 11, 12-year-old kid, the impact of that moment in my life.
Oh, that's beautiful, Luke. And, it's just so funny when we start looking back at our life, even just simple moments like that, we just realize they have such a strong impact that we maybe just even take for granted. We kind of gloss over it because it was like, oh, that was just a quick moment. And I guess that's why parable stories matter to me too, is that it can be these small moments and the trajectory of our life can be forever changed. So I'd love to ask you, Luke, when you say like alignment with the Bible, I mean, that is probably a day-to-day choice because that's hard. We live in the world, we're human. Talk to me about like the challenges of choosing to be aligned with the Bible each and every day.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, there are so many areas that we can go into with that question that I'm going to just choose maybe one specific one to really talk about, primarily because I also run a nonprofit today that trains leaders around the world. And one of the, I think, biggest misconceptions among Christians is what is leadership? And, we have a model that is very top-down, very authoritarian, very utilitarian. The world basically, it's all about power and authority. And yet we have a model in Jesus, a biblical model of one who comes down and washes his disciples' feet. One who says, the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. The one who said, the Greeks, the Gentiles, they lord it over you, but not so with you. If you're going to be my disciple, you are going to be a servant leader. And that probably has been one of the most powerful biblical alignments for me. When I moved to Asia, I was directing this nonprofit to reach unreached people groups. I had my first team. I was the founder. I was the director. And I remember that first meeting, Danielle, like it was yesterday. And these were 5 of my friends on our first team. And we were in this room and I was sharing, my strategies, my goals. I had a wonderful plan for their lives, right? And you could have cut the air in the room with a knife. Why? Because I wasn't a good listener. I wasn't there to collaborate. I had a very top-down vision of leadership. I did not have a biblically aligned perspective of servant leadership that Jesus taught us. And again, we've got a lot of great stuff out there from the world on leadership, and even the world on leadership. It works. There's a lot of styles of leadership that work. But if we're going to be aligned with Jesus, first of all, we're going to be a follower. We're going to get our marching orders from above. Going back to when we moved to Southeast Asia for the first time, my wife and I, somebody gave us that book, Experiencing God by Blackaby. I don't know if you remember, had the burning bush on the front.
Yes.
It was one of those big pop books like 20, 30 years ago. And what I remember, and I needed to hear this because we were starting a brand new organization. And typically what we do, we're leaders. We got vision. We've got passion, right? So we go out there, we build something, and then we say, hey, God, would you come over and bless this thing? And what Blackaby told my wife and I is that God is at work in our world, and we must join him where he is at work. And that was so powerful. Here we were starting a new organization, but now we began to lift up our eyes to look around us and to say, where is God already at work in Southeast Asia? Where are indigenous Christians that we can begin to partner with and learn from? We don't have all the answers. Typically, as leaders, we come in with all the answers. We have all the ideas. We're very authoritative or whatever. And Jesus teaches us no position, no title, never wrote a book. And he teaches that the authority is completely different. He had an authority unlike the scribes and Pharisees, unlike the religious leaders of that day. And what gave him authority? He was a person who lived under authority. He was a man worth following is how we like to say it. When you have a personal authority, when you have a relational authority, it'll take you much farther than a title and a position. Like, do my kids act just the same as when I'm here at home as when I'm gone? In business world, I like to ask, managers and foremen, do your people work just as hard for you when you're in the room or on the job site as when you're not? And that all depends on whether or not you're a leader worth following. Really, and I'll end with this little bit here, and I could go on a lot on Jesus on leadership, but it was more about after he left than when he was here, right? A success is all about, do I raise up successors? And Jesus actually told his guys, he said, greater works you're going to do when I go back to the Father. That's phenomenal to me. He set them up for success. It was about a movement. Jesus was not about himself. He was always talking about his Father and doing his Father's will. And we're kind of messed up on Jesus, I think, because we only interpret him from the resurrection, which is when he is glorified, when he is exalted as Lord. And we ought to focus on that. But in terms of a leadership role model, Danielle, we need to focus on pre-resurrection. That's when he's giving us a model of how we should be leaders today. We're in our pre-resurrected bodies. We're not resurrected yet. We're not reigning on high. It's not about glory. And even Jesus says, call no man your father. It's not about titles and positions. Not that titles and positions are wrong. It's just that primarily we live under submission, under the authority of the Father, and we're here about something bigger than ourselves. Jesus modeled that. And he did this perfectly before he was resurrected. I think he just gives us a perfect model for leadership.
That's so good, Luke, because I think about the people in my life who have had that leadership role. I've seen all kinds. I've been in church leadership. I've been in work corporate worlds, and you can just tell who is leading out of a place of listening, like what you just said, and really hearing those that you work with and just being kind and respectful. I mean, really, even Hans was leading in that one moment. And so when we think and go back to Jesus, we can see what you said, these models of how he just lived his life. Luke, you have a master's in leadership. Is it leadership or master in leadership development?
It's master's in Christian leadership from Asbury Seminary.
And I would just ask, because I think a lot of people question this when they hear leadership. Did they think, is that me? Like, is that for everyone? And I'd love for you to speak into that. Does everyone have the capability to be a leader?
So I believe it was John Maxwell who said leadership is influence, pure and simple. That's it. And everybody has influence. Even the most introverted person, right, they say anyhow, impacts the lives of like 10,000 people in their lifetime. They interact with. Like every time I go into a Walmart or a Best Buy and I see the name tag of somebody and I say, hey, Joe, how's it going today? Or Marjorie, I just want to wish you a great day. That's a leadership moment, right? Is just having influence. Just to give you a quick example of this, one of my favorite people in the world that had tremendous influence, leadership in my life, Danielle, was a lady by the name of Jean Erb. And she was my grade 6 vacation Bible school teacher. And we weren't good kids. We misbehaved. I'm sure we made it really tough for her. But Jean always believed in me. A couple years after grade 6 vacation Bible school, I was singing in a choir with Jean, and I was a baritone. And I don't know if you know what a baritone is. I say it's barely a tone. You're not high enough for tenor. You're not low enough for bass. So you get like 5 notes every 3 songs. Well, I'm a baritone. I don't have a good singing voice. And Jean, who was the orator for the choir, like she had all the ethos and pathos and just the os in her voice. She could reduce the crowd to tears. And she goes to the director and she says, I think Luke should have one of my speaking parts. In the Mennonite world, first of all, women don't have a lot of opportunities to share their voice. And she had a great voice and she had incredible influence in the choir. But she goes and gives some of that part to me. And subsequently, since then, she has encouraged me on social media. When I go back to Canada, sometimes I'll drop in to see her. And she's just been an influencer in my life. She's a mom. She was a Bible school teacher. But look at the influence. Look at the leadership that she had with me, Danielle. And I value people like that. And I think, so many times we think it's about a position or a title, but it's really about setting other people up for success, right? And again, back to Jesus' model, it's about glorifying our Father in heaven. Way too much leadership is about glorifying the leader. Look at me, the American Idol, the perspective of a lot of, CEOs and unfortunately even some pastors, that it's really about this mega personality. Can I just say this yet, that a huge shout out to the Bridge for their leadership model. You never know who's going to show up at our campuses to speak. They really work hard to keep from having a cultic personality. They rotate their teaching team. And I love that. And again, I'm not saying anything about other churches. My observation here at the Bridge has just been very positive of saying it's really not about the communicator, about the leader. And not that we shouldn't be good examples. Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. But the emphasis is on the message. It's on something bigger than the leader.
Yeah, I just watched a documentary about a very large church that's well known, but just, the background. And the reason I watch it, not to be like, I have to know all the gory details, but as a person who's in church leadership as well, I need to have those guardrails and that mindset of place of like, there is a path that has taken this church to a very dark place. And so what are those steps and things that we need to have in place so that we can be the leaders that God has asked us to be? Whether we are working in a ministry, whether we are just tending to our kids at home, or if we are just, we're driving a bus, it doesn't matter. How can we continue to leave Jesus on that platform rather than ourselves?
Right.
And so that's so important.
We have to learn how to steward our leadership, right? Mm-hmm. Some of us have a bigger platform than others, and we have to be very wise in how we steward that platform. I just think so many times where leaders go off the rails is we start believing our press reports. We start listening to all the applause. And, what did Jesus do? He snuck off into the desert. I've been processing something, Danielle, and maybe, you're in church leadership. You understand some of these dynamics. Maybe good to hear you reflect on this. But I've been asking myself the question, what does it look like to stay intentionally small? Everything in our lives is about getting bigger and getting better. It's about going to the next level. Business, how can we scale this, right? And bigger is always better. But, in Jesus' economy, think about the fact that he had 12 guys. And, he spent most of his time with those 12. Even out of the 12, he had the 3. I don't know if you've heard of the Pareto principle, this famous, Italian guy that came up with an 80-20 rule called the Pareto principle. But, it didn't begin with some Italian guy. It began with Jesus. Out of the 12, he had 3, Pete, Jim, and John, right? And I guess it's a 25-75. And then the other thing that I love about the 12 is Jesus had a Judas, Danielle. That's pretty crazy. You can do all the right stuff in leadership and still have somebody who turns out bad, right? But Jesus gave us a model. Go deep with the few to impact the many. And he stayed intentionally small. And that's actually what created this incredible movement called Christianity that we're still with today. I'd love to hear your reflections on that.
Yeah, I think for me, I love to connect with people, and I will say my story and connect and go deep with anyone if you let me. But I have noticed over the years how it is so important to really keep that inner circle of friendship and also like the people. So my husband and I, we have a 10 and a 13-year-old. So, those are my people right now that I should be investing in. And anytime I'm pouring into other people, like I I always ask myself, are they pouring back into me? Because if I'm always giving out and I'm not receiving anything back, like I really start questioning that and wondering, not to say that we can never do that, but if I'm just doing that in everyone else's life. And then just having that time of investment. I mean, we will have our kids for the rest of our life, but this is like a dedicated time where we can dive into that. And for friendship too. Gosh, just having like those solid people that you can know that, at 2:00 in the morning, I can call them and say like, hey, I need you right now. So yeah, I think that's smaller on that 80-20 scale of like finding who are those people. And that I feel like can change in different seasons of life, for sure.
That's right. We should all have mentors at every stage in our lives. You make me think about a quote from Ken Blanchard who said, feedback is the breakfast of champions. And I know we all thought Wheaties were, but it's feedback. And we need people who can speak directly, call us to account. We need people speaking into our lives. And I think that's probably, you alluded to this, some of these pastors that get into these silos and they get so high and, no one even has the courage to speak into their lives anymore. But as a leader, the higher you go, you have to be more intentional to get people to speak into your life, because the higher you go, people are going to try to win your favor, right? They're going to say nice things to you to try to get nice things back from you. And so it gets harder and harder the higher you go in leadership to actually get truth tellers speaking truth to you.
Yeah. And I think whether or not you consider yourself like a leader in a larger scale, but just think about that for yourself too, of we can put ourselves in silos all the time. We can silo ourselves away from God because we're going to church or reading our Bibles, but is it impacting us? Are people like truly sharing the truth into our lives? Because it's super easy to become isolated and not have anyone being that guardrail for us. So that's my word of warning.
And that's a good word of warning. It really is.
All right. Well, Luke, you are kind of I don't know, would you say you're in a season of transition? You're starting a new role at the Bridge. You've gone through so many different roles in your life. Is this yet another adventure like smuggling Bibles into China? Or is this something you're like, I'm really excited for this? Or is this, I'm a little nervous about it?
I tell some people there's a certain amount of fear and trepidation. And it's not fear, like an unhealthy fear. It's really this idea that unless God builds the church, we labor in vain who build it. And I, as a speaker, Danielle, one of the things I fear the most is getting up on the stage and doing a really good job. And then walking off the stage and knowing in my spirit, God was not glorified. God was not in it. Oh yeah, I made people laugh. Yeah, I entertained people. Yeah, they got some points, whatever. But it really wasn't God building his church. And so that's one of the fears that I have is, here I am, I'm 51, I've done a number of things and I can do this or I can do that. But really, am I in alignment with God? Am I joining him? Back to Blackieby's book, Experiencing God. Is he building his church? What does God want to do? Am I still sensitive? I think the older we get, we become professional Christians. And it's hard for us to stay sensitive, to stay innocent, to stay open to fresh anointing from God's Spirit. And so that would be one concern that I've got going into this. And then another thing, I got to back up a little bit. When we were missionaries for 10 years in Southeast Asia, we were what they would call faith-based missionaries. And we know what it's like to get down to like double digits in our checking account. Well, we moved back to North America. I looked at my wife. I said, should I go get a job and make a wage and we can budget and all that kind of stuff? And she's like, no, I really believe God's hand is on your life. I encourage you to stay in ministry. Well, in the Mennonite world, we don't have paid pastors in the conservative Mennonite world. They all are bivocational. And so, being invited into a lot of Mennonite churches to speak, everyone thought, well, he must also have a job. Well, I didn't. And so those were lean times for us. And then I went to seminary, thankfully with low income, I was able to get a lot of scholarship money. But what happened is a lot of my Mennonite pastor friends, where I was speaking in their churches, these guys were also business people. And they started inviting me into the business world. I was a master trainer for an organization called Lead Like Jesus. And I was doing all these Lead Like Jesus one-day events for churches and youth groups and whatever. But the business said, hey, we want, again, these were Mennonite Christian businessmen saying, we want this stuff in our businesses. So I began to start sharing these principles of servant leadership based on the life of Jesus Christ in the Mennonite business world. And that really opened up a lot of doors for me. Probably 70-80% of my time to this day is still spent in the Amish Mennonite business world, teaching people on leadership principles like Jesus. And I talk on a lot of different things as well, but they're all faith-based, biblically centered seminars or workshops or coaching that I do in the business world. And looking back at all those lean years, the business world pays a lot better. And so we've had the ability in the last few years to start actually putting some money aside for retirement. I've actually been able to afford to do a few things that I wasn't able to in the past. We were actually able to buy a condo. My dad helped me buy our first house. And so, it's been kind of a new era of just really fruitfulness, just even in terms of finances. But now kind of leaving the business world a little bit, I'm going to still be in that somewhat. And believe me, the bridge is taking good care of me, but it's not as lucrative as the business world. And so it's also for me at age 51 saying, man, I'm really comfortable doing what I'm doing, running a nonprofit, working in the business world. But now I'm stepping into a new role that I've frankly never done before. I've pastored people. I've shepherded people. It's not that I've not done those things, but I've never led a campus. I've never been in the role, the capacity that they're asking me to serve in. And they believe in me. And sometimes I kind of look at myself and say, what is it that they believe in? I don't have all this experience that these other guys have. And I'm amazed and I'm learning a lot these days from my friends at the bridge. We just have an incredible team. I know I'm going to learn a lot from them as I move into this new role. But in some ways, it's leaving my comfort zone again. And maybe it's that God-inspired adventure thing that he put in me from when I was really young. But ask me in a couple years from now and I'll be able to reflect and tell you whether or not the journey was exciting as I think it's going to be. And I really believe it is.
Well, Luke, thank you for being honest about that, because it is holding that tension of humility and also just like that sense of like, I'm not sure what's going to happen, or, the scaredness of just being like, am I good enough? Like, am I worthy to be in this role? So I really appreciate that, because I think a lot of people, like, you can see certain people's titles, but you have no idea, like, the mental work that goes into and the prayers, how long somebody has worked to get to that point and what's been behind that. So, well, Luke, if people wanted to get connected to you, how can they do that?
Kind of like my dad, 3 mission boards, I have to have 3 websites. So I've got my business website, and I'll still be operating in that, though I'm going to be scaling back in my business speaking and teaching. And that one is just simply my name.com. So LukeKuepfer.com. And then the nonprofit that I run, basically, we train leaders around the world, Christian leaders, some business leaders, but mostly pastors. That's really the second website, which is reverbnetwork.org, this reverberating influence that we have with our lives. That's where we took the name from. So that's really the nonprofit leadership development site. And then I have a third website for my nonprofit speaking called thetruthmadesimple.org, thetruthmadesimple.org. But they're all linked together. People can find me there. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter, and got a YouTube channel, a couple things like that.
Well, all of Luke's contact information will be available in the show notes. Luke, thank you. You are definitely a very interesting man. I'm so grateful for our conversation today. Thank you so much for taking the time and spending it with me.
Well, Danielle, it's been an honor to be with you today. And I want to thank you for just the opportunity to really share what God has done. I am humbled when I think about where I was at as a little Amish Mennonite kid growing up in Southern Ontario. And I would have never dreamed of all the adventures that God took me on. My life quote today, it's not original with me, but it's simply the best is yet to come. And I think that's true for all of us. It's just going to get better, right? We know the end of the story. We know what he has done, what he's doing, and what he will do. And it's just such a privilege, such an honor to be part of the family of God. Such an honor to meet you today. And God bless you, Danielle, in your influence and your leadership as you lead like Jesus.
I don't know about you, but I'm still thinking about if I had the guts to be a Bible smuggler, right? I appreciate Luke sharing his perspective on leadership, on reach people groups, and biblical alignment with us today. To connect with Luke, simply visit DanielleZapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Luke today. Number 1, What does it look like for you to stay intentionally small in your life? I know Luke asked that of myself, but I'd like for you to think, what is your one way that you can stay intentionally small? Number 2, in what ways have you aligned yourself with the Bible so that you are pouring out into the world? And if you can't think of anything right now, prayerfully consider some spaces that might be options for you. One easy way you can support the Parable Podcast is simply by sharing this episode with a friend. If you could pass that along today, that really helps people find out about these amazing parable stories. And thank you so much to my technical producer of a husband, Eric, for his amazing editing skills. That's going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how he has provided you with leadership and biblical alignment. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.